Sael Korrin had learned to read a room the way other people read a pressure gauge. Drift before the crack. The wrongness before the alarm ever sounds. Tonight, walking the ring corridor of Corvel Station with her second cup of stim tea going cold in her hand, every reading came back wrong, and she could not have told you why. It was nothing she could name. The lighting was the same warm amber it always was at the start of third shift. The refinery core 2 decks down hummed the same steady note it had hummed every night for the 11 years she had commanded the station. And yet something in her chest kept insisting she walk faster, check the exits, count the number of people between her and the nearest airlock, without ever telling her why the counting mattered. She stopped counting when she reached the hydroponics bay, because that was where Dax Oren was, and Dax had a way of making rooms feel like they were not, in fact, about to fall apart. He was kneeling between 2 rows of pale blue leaf vine, sleeves pushed up past his forearms, replacing a cracked irrigation line with the unhurried patience of a man who had nowhere else in the galaxy he needed to be. 2 station younglings sat cross-legged nearby, waiting for him to finish so he could go back to losing, again, at the folding tile game he had taught them 6 months earlier and had somehow never once won since. "You're doing the thing again," Dax said, without looking up. "What thing?" "The thing where you walk in like you expect the ceiling to fall on you." He set the old irrigation line aside and reached for its replacement, his hands moving with the kind of easy competence that came from doing the same small task 100 times before. "Bad shift." "Quiet shift," Sael said, and that was the trouble exactly. Corvel Station ran a skeleton administrative crew during third shift, a pair of duty officers, a handful of junior techs, and whatever section of the station happened to be awake by circumstance rather than schedule. Quiet shifts were when quiet things went wrong, and nobody noticed until the damage was already old. Dax finally looked up. He had an ordinary face by human standards, she'd been told so once, with clear intent to insult, by a visiting Commonwealth attaché who did not understand that Sael found nothing about that face ordinary at all. Brown eyes, tired at the edges in the particular way of someone who worked more hours than his job title required. The kind of face that put frightened refugees and furious union representatives at ease within minutes. That, officially, was his job. Liaison specialist. In practice, he was most of the reason Corvel Station had gone 11 years without a single labor dispute turning violent, on a station that housed 6 different species with 6 different definitions of a fair wage. "You want me to walk the ring with you," he said. "Not a question. I want you to tell me I'm being paranoid." "You're being paranoid." He smiled and rose, brushing soil from his knees. "I'll walk with you anyway." One of the younglings, a small, indignant Ithran hatchling named Parrot, whose wing plates hadn't yet hardened past the soft translucent green of early adolescence, clicked a complaint about the unfinished game. "Tomorrow," Dax promised. "I still owe you a rematch for the humiliation you handed me last week." "You lose on purpose," Parrot said, with the flat, unshakable certainty only a 9-year-old could manage. "I really, truly do not," Dax said, and Sael caught the faint twitch at the corner of his mouth that suggested Parrot was closer to correct than either adult in the room was prepared to admit. They walked the ring together after that, past the darkened administrative offices, the quiet mess hall, and the long observation window that looked down on the storm-marbled gas giant the station orbited, a slow bruise colored churn the size of 6 worlds, turning in permanent silence below them. Sael felt her shoulders loosen the way they always did with Dax beside her. It wasn't that he was strong, exactly, or clever, though he was both in his own unhurried way. It was that he moved through the universe as though it had already decided, quietly, to be kind to him, and after 11 years working at his side, some of that certainty had rubbed off on her whether she'd asked for it or not. They were passing the cargo transfer bay when a maintenance drone the size of a serving tray shed a full crate of sealed nutrient packs from the loading rail 3 meters overhead. Sael had time to see it fall. She had no time at all to do anything about it. Dax's hand shot out and caught the crate an arm's length from her skull, absorbing 40 kilograms of falling cargo with a single controlled step backward, setting it down on the deck as gently as if someone had handed him a sleeping child instead. "Rails slipping again," he said, glancing up at the track, already reaching for his wrist terminal to flag it. "I'll get maintenance on it before someone else walks under it." Sael stood very still, her tea forgotten in her hand, staring at the crate and then at him. "That fell fast," she said. "Crates usually do." "You caught it like it was falling slow." Dax shrugged, keying the flag into his terminal without looking up. "Good reflexes," he said, easily, the words coming out practiced, worn smooth by repetition, The way a man answers a question he has answered many times before and expects, this time as every time, to be the last, comes from years around heavy freight. It was a perfectly reasonable answer. Sael had known him for 11 years and had never once had cause to doubt anything he told her about himself. They finished the ring walk without further incident, though Sael found she was watching him differently for the rest of it, in a way she couldn't quite name and didn't yet have reason to examine closely. He pointed out, as he always did, the small things she'd long since stopped noticing about her own station: a flicker in the corridor lighting on Deck 6 that had been getting worse for weeks, a supply requisition form that had been sitting unsigned in the mess hall's back office for so long the ink had started to fade, the particular way Parrot's grandmother always saved the last portion of her evening meal for a hatchling 3 tables, over whose parents worked the late refinery shift and never quite made it back in time to eat with her. He noticed everything. Sael had always assumed that was simply the nature of a good liaison specialist, a man trained to read rooms the way she was trained to read pressure gauges. She had never once wondered whether the noticing came from somewhere else entirely. "You're staring," Dak said, as they reached the lift bank that would carry her back toward her own quarters. "I'm allowed to stare at my liaison specialist. It's in the job description. Mine, not yours." "Is it?" he said, with the particular mild amusement that always made her want to keep talking to him long after she should have gone to bed. "I'm making it up as I go," she admitted. 11 years, and I still am." "Most good jobs are like that," Dak said. "Good night, Sael." "Good night." She went to bed telling herself the tight feeling in her chest had simply been exhaustion, the ordinary fraying of nerves that came with running a station whose funding renewal was still, for months later, tied up in a Commonwealth budget committee that seemed to enjoy the delay for its own sake. She was wrong. And 3 decks below her, in a maintenance corridor that hadn't seen an inspection in longer than it should have, someone was already cutting the seal on an access hatch that was never meant to open from the outside. She did not know yet that tonight was the night that would change. Corvel Station did not run on or alone, though, or was what kept the lights on. It ran on a fragile, carefully maintained fiction that 6 species with 6 different ideas of dignity and fairness could share one set of decks, one air supply, and one chain of command without any of them deciding, on any given day, that the arrangement no longer suited them. Sael had built most of that fiction herself, in 11 years of budget negotiations, labor mediations, and quiet, unglamorous compromise. She had also, if she was honest with herself over a second cup of tea she wasn't supposed to still be drinking at this hour, built a great deal of it on the assumption that the humans aboard her station were, in the broad Commonwealth taxonomy every species eventually absorbed without meaning to, the slow species. Gentle. Deliberate. A little behind the reflexes of the Ithran, a little behind the raw strength of the station's handful of Corvain engineers, valuable mostly for patience and diplomacy rather than anything physical. It was not a cruel assumption. It was, if anything, an affectionate one, and it had served the station well. Humans made excellent mediators precisely because nobody watching them across a negotiating table ever felt threatened. Sael had never once questioned where that particular reputation came from. She had simply accepted it, the way one accepts that gravity holds a station in orbit without asking exactly which laws of physics are doing the holding. "You're thinking too loudly again," Dak said, from across the small liaison office they occasionally shared when paperwork overlapped, which was often. "I can hear it from here." "The Commonwealth Budget Committee pushed our renewal review back another 6 weeks, Sael said, not looking up from her console. 6 weeks, Dax. That's 6 weeks of running the station on reserve funding, while the Ashfold Combine's lobbyists whisper in every ear that will listen about how much more efficiently a private consortium could run our refinery. They've been whispering that for 2 years. They've been getting louder for 6 months." She rubbed her eyes. "Korrin thinks we should offer the Combine a minority stake, just to quiet them down. Says it's the pragmatic play." Dax was quiet for a moment, in the particular way that meant he was choosing his next words carefully rather than simply not having any. "Do you trust him?" "Korrin, I mean. He's been my deputy director for 4 years. I left him in command of this entire station twice while I was off-world." Sael frowned at her own answer even as she gave it. "I don't know why you're asking that." "No reason," Dax said, too easily, and went back to the maintenance schedule he'd been reviewing, though Sael noticed, filed it away without quite examining it, the way one files away a smell of smoke before deciding whether to worry about it, that he had spent an unusual amount of time over the past few weeks walking the station's low-maintenance shafts on his own time, mapping routes that had nothing to do with his liaison duties. Bren Talon found her in the corridor outside the refinery core 2 days later, still turning the budget committee's delay over in her mind, and fell into step beside her with the particular heaviness of an engineer who had numbers to deliver that nobody wanted to hear. "Reserve funding gets us through the next 6 weeks, he said, without preamble, because Bren had never once in 11 years wasted time on pleasantries when there were figures to be discussed. Maybe 8, if we defer the conduit resurfacing on Deck 3, which I would strongly advise against, because that conduit is the reason Deck 3 hasn't had a coolant leak in 4 years. And if the committee pushes the review back again, then we are having a very different conversation about which systems we can afford to defer, and I don't like any of the answers I can already see coming." Bren's mandibles clicked, a sound Sael had learned over the years to read as frustration rather than agitation. The Ashfold Combine's lobbyists aren't stupid, Overseer. They know exactly how long a funding delay it takes before a station like ours starts looking less like a stubborn holdout and more like a burden the Commonwealth would rather offload to a private buyer. You think Korrin's minority stake proposal is part of that? I think Korrin's minority stake proposal reads exactly like something written by someone who's already decided which side he's betting on, Bren said. And I think you should ask him directly, before someone else asks it for you in a way you won't enjoy. She meant to ask him. She told herself that for 2 more days, each one busier than the last, layered atop the earlier promise she'd made herself about the maintenance shafts, until the accumulated weight of things she'd meant to ask and hadn't sat, unexamined, at the back of her mind like a debt quietly coming due. She asked him about the shafts, at least, once, in passing, a week before everything changed. They were sharing the last quiet meal of a long day in the mess hall, the room mostly emptied out around them, the low hum of the ventilation systems the only sound beyond their own voices. "Ren mentioned your badge has been showing up in the lower maintenance logs," Sael said, keeping her tone light, testing the shape of the question before committing fully to it. "A lot, lately. Off duty." "Just making sure I know my way around," Dak said, with a smile that was warm and entirely unrevealing. 11 years on a station, I ought to know it better than the maps do." "That's not really an answer." "No," he agreed, easily, "it isn't." He turned his cup slowly between his hands, not quite meeting her eyes, and for a moment Sael thought he might actually tell her something real, something underneath the practiced deflection she'd never once had reason to question before tonight. Then the moment passed, the way it always did, and he simply added, "It's nothing you need to worry about. I promise." "I'm not worried," Sael said, which was almost true. "I am curious. There's a difference." "With you, there usually is," Dak said, and the warmth in it was genuine enough that she let the question go, the way she always did, because 11 years of trust had taught her that his silences were never the dangerous kind. She hadn't pushed. That was, she would later think, the great luxury of trusting someone completely. You stopped asking the second question, the one that might have actually mattered, because the first answer had always been enough before. Parrot's grandmother, a station elder named Sael Korrin who had lived through the founding of Corvel Station and had opinions about nearly everything since, cornered Sael in the mess hall a few days later with the particular directness only the very old permit themselves. "You're human," Sael said, without preamble, settling across from Sael with a bowl of the pale mash that passed for elder-suitable nutrition aboard the station. "The younglings adore him. He's very good with them." "He's very good at a great many things he doesn't discuss," Sael said, tilting her head in the way Ithran did when they were studying something more closely than their posture let on. "I've watched him for 11 years, Overseer. He moves like a man who has trained his own body not to be noticed. There's a difference between gentleness that is simply gentle, and gentleness that is chosen every day, on purpose, over something else. That's a strange thing to say about a hydroponics volunteer." "Is it?" Sael said, and ate her mash, and said nothing further on the subject, though Sael found the words rattling around in the back of her mind for days afterward, unwilling to settle into any shape she could name. It was, in hindsight, the clearest warning anyone gave her. She did not recognize it as one until it was almost too late to matter. The first real crack came 4 days before the alarm, though Sael did not understand it as a crack until much later, when she had the luxury of looking backward instead of forward. She was crossing the administrative ring on her way to a supply audit when she passed the closed door of Deputy Director Vek's office and heard, through the imperfect soundproofing that had never quite been budgeted for a proper fix, 2 voices. One was Korrin's. The other belonged, unmistakably, to a woman whose accent placed her somewhere in the outer trade corridors the Ashfold Combine liked to recruit from. Formal bid gets blocked again. We do it the way we discussed, the woman was saying. Quiet. Contained. Nobody gets hurt who doesn't force the issue. The overseer won't force anything if she never sees it coming, Korrin's voice answered, flat and reasonable in the way that made Sael's skin prickle even before she understood why. She trusts her people too much to watch them closely. It's her only real weakness. Sael did not stop walking. She had learned, over 11 years, that the worst thing you could do upon overhearing something you were not meant to hear was to let your body announce that you had heard it. She kept her pace even until she reached the corner, and only then did she let herself stand still, heart working harder than the moment should have required, and think through exactly what she had just listened to. She told Ren Carvers that evening, in the security chief's cramped office 2 decks down, over the low hum of surveillance feeds nobody outside security clearance was meant to see. His talk to Ashfold contacts before, Ren said, unsurprised in the particular weary way of someone who has suspected something for a while and is relieved, finally, to have it confirmed by someone with the authority to act on it. I flagged 2 pings from an unregistered relay 3 weeks ago. Couldn't trace the origin without a warrant I didn't have grounds to request yet. I filed the concern. It's sitting in a queue behind 11 other lower priority items, because nobody wants to accuse a deputy director of anything without proof. Get the proof, Sael said. I'm trying. Ren hesitated, glancing at her console, then back at Sael with an expression that was harder to read than usual. There's something else. While I was pulling maintenance access logs to check who's been in the lower shafts recently, routine, nothing to do with VEC, your liaison specialist's badge shows up 11 times in the past 3 weeks. Off duty. No maintenance requests filed to explain any of it. Sael thought of Dax's easy, unrevealing smile. Just making sure I know my way around. Are you concerned about him too? She asked, and heard, in her own voice, something that surprised her, not suspicion exactly, but a kind of bracing, the sound of a person checking a structure for weight it might not be built to bear. Ren considered the question with the same careful weighing she gave everything. No, she said finally. Whatever he's doing down there, my instinct says it isn't against us. But I don't like not knowing things about people with unrestricted station access, overseer. Even people I like. Ren pulled up the access log again, scrolling through timestamps with a frown that had nothing to do with Dax and everything to do with the pattern sitting beside his entries. There's something else worth flagging, while we're on the subject of things I can't quite prove yet. Korrin's staff badge shows entries in the lower junction too. Fewer than your liaison specialists, but they cluster around the same 3 weeks, and 2 of them line up almost exactly with the timestamps on those unregistered compings I mentioned. You think they crossed paths down there? I think the lower junction on this station has had more off-hours foot traffic in the last month than in the 4 years before it, and I don't believe in that many coincidences stacking up in one place. Ren closed the log with a decisive tap. I'd like authorization to pull full sensor records for the junction, going back 6 weeks. Properly, this time, with a warrant that'll hold up if this ends up in front of a Commonwealth tribunal. Draft it. I'll sign it first thing tomorrow. Tomorrow, Ren repeated, with the faint, weary skepticism of someone who had learned, over years of station bureaucracy, exactly how often tomorrow turned into next week once the next crisis arrived to crowd it out. Tomorrow, Sael promised again, and meant it, and would spend a great many hours in the days that followed wishing she had simply signed it that night instead. Neither do I, Sael admitted. I'll ask him. She meant to. She told herself that for 3 more days, each one busier than the last, until the 4th night arrived and the question became, abruptly, the least important thing happening aboard Corvel Station. The alarm woke her at 0340 station time, a low double chime that meant structural fault, not intruder, which was the only reason she did not immediately assume the worst. She was wrong about that too. By the time she reached the command deck, half-dressed and running on adrenaline instead of the sleep she'd barely managed 3 hours of, Chief Engineer Bren Talon was already at the main console, wing plates rattling with the particular agitation Ithran showed when they were working hard not to panic in front of subordinates. Cargo Bay 4, he said, before she'd even reached him. Pressure seal blew on the outer hatch. Hull breach warning, and the internal blast doors haven't engaged. Haven't engaged, or were overridden. Bren's mandibles clicked once, unhappily. Overridden. From inside the maintenance junction. Sael felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, though the deck itself was perfectly level. Who has junction override authority? 6 people, Bren said. You, me, Chief Carvers, and 3 names on Deputy Director Vec's staff roster. Sael was already moving toward the security office before he finished the sentence, because 11 years running Corvel Station had taught her that the question that mattered was never who has access. It was who was awake at 0340 to use it. Ren Carvers met her halfway down the corridor, her security chief's usual composure fraying at the edges. I tried to flag this, she said, falling into step. 3 weeks ago. Korrin requested full maintenance schematics for the lower decks, said it was for the refinery efficiency audit. I signed off because the paperwork checked out, and I've regretted it every day since, because the request came through 2 hours after that closed-door meeting I told you about. The one with the ashfold voice. Cargo Bay 4 connects to the lower junction, Sael said. It was not a guess. They reached the corridor outside the cargo bay to find it already hazed with drifting atmosphere, scrubbers straining against a leak that should not have been possible with the blast doors functioning. 6 figures in unmarked void suits were moving cargo through the breached hatch with the unhurried efficiency of people who had rehearsed exactly this. One of them turned and saw Sael and Ren standing in the corridor, and did not so much as flinch. Overseer Korrin, said a voice she recognized immediately through the chute speaker, flat and pleasant in a way that made her skin crawl. Deputy Director Korrin Vec stepped forward, helmet visor lifted just enough to show his face. You're up early. You're stealing my stations or reserves through a hull breach you engineered, Sael said, because there was no version of the next 30 seconds where pretending otherwise served her. I'm correcting an allocation the Commonwealth's been too slow to correct itself, Vec said, almost reasonable, almost bored. This station could triple its output under proper management. You said no to the combine on principle. Now we are doing it the inefficient way. This is theft, Korrin, and a breach that could have killed half the crew on this deck. The breach was controlled, he said, with the faint irritation of a man accused of sloppiness he considered beneath him. Mostly controlled. His gaze slid past her, down the corridor. Where's your human? Sael did not answer. Ren's hand had already dropped to the sidearm at her hip. Those 6 armed figures against 2 unarmed officers was not a fight either of them could win, and both of them knew it. He's not here, Sael said, which was true, and which she found herself, with sudden and urgent fervor, wanting to remain true for as long as possible. Good, Vec said. I'd rather this stay simple. Step back. Let my people finish loading, and nobody else needs to get hurt tonight. It was, Sael would think much later, the closest thing to mercy Korrin Vec offered anyone that whole night. And it was the last calm moment before the corridor behind her filled with running footsteps that did not belong to station security, and the quiet, ordinary life she had built on Corvel Station for 11 years began, very quickly, to come apart. The footsteps belonged to 3 more of Vec's people, hurrying up from the lower junction, and the sudden crackle of a comm channel that should have been secure. Deck 4's compromised, one of them was saying, breathless. Duty officer got a distress ping out before we reached the bridge relay. Station wide alert inside 2 minutes. Vec's face didn't change, but something in his posture did. A shift from patient theft to a man recalculating in real time. Then we accelerate, he said. Secure the overseer. If the alert's already out, we hold what leverage we can get. Sael understood, with the particular clarity that arrives just before violence, that secure the overseer meant something closer to hostage than escort, and that Ren, beside her, had understood it half a second before she had. Run, Ren said quietly, and put herself between Sael and the 6 advancing figures, which was either the bravest or the most foolish thing Sael had ever seen her do, and possibly both. Sael ran. She made it 3 steps before a gloved hand closed around her arm from behind, wrenching her back hard enough that her shoulder screamed. She twisted, more instinct than training, and saw Ren go down under 2 of them, disarmed, not shot, which told her Vec's plan for tonight hadn't yet stretched to mass casualties. Small comfort, held against the hand still gripping her arm and the sound of boots crossing the deck toward her. This doesn't have to be difficult, Vec said, close enough now that she could see her own reflection in his visor. You come with us to the lower dock, stay calm, and in 6 hours you're back in your office with a generous consulting fee and nothing worth reporting. You blew a hull breach, Sael said. There is no version of tonight that doesn't get reported. There's a version where you're alive to report it, Vec said, and something in the flatness of his voice told her he meant it as reassurance, which was somehow worse than a threat. That was when the lights along the corridor's upper edge flickered, dimmed, and cut entirely, plunging the stretch of deck into the red glow of emergency power, and a voice Sael knew better than her own said, from somewhere close and unnervingly calm in the sudden dark, "Let go of her." It was Dax, and his voice, for the first time in 11 years, carried something underneath the gentleness she had never once heard there before, not anger exactly, but something with an edge to it, patient and immovable as bedrock. Vec's grip on her arm tightened instinctively, his head turning toward the sound. "This doesn't concern liaison staff," he said, though his voice had lost some of its earlier ease. "Stand down, Mr. Korrin. Nobody needs to get hurt." "I agree completely," Dax said, from somewhere in the red-lit dark none of them could quite pin down. "Which is why you're going to let go of her right now." Later, when Sael tried to reconstruct exactly what happened in the next several seconds, she found she could not do it in order. It happened too fast for order, faster than anything she'd witnessed in 11 years of supply strikes, reactor scares, and one memorable pirate incursion in her third year that had taken the station's entire security detail 40 minutes to resolve. This took less than 15 seconds. The first suited figure nearest the corridor bend simply folded to the deck without a sound, the way a puppet folds when someone cuts the string, and Sael understood only afterward that Dax had already moved past her in the dark, close enough to touch, and she had felt nothing but a faint disturbance of air. The second and third turned toward the sound of the first one falling and found nothing to aim at, because Dax was no longer where he'd been half a heartbeat before. Sael would swear afterward that she saw him move between them. Not fast, exactly, that wasn't the right word. Fast implied effort, a straining toward speed. But already there, the way water is already at the bottom of a slope before anyone finishes asking how it got there. Vec released her arm to draw his own weapon, and that was the last mistake he made that Sael watched happen in real time, because the moment his grip loosened, Dax was between them, one hand closing over the barrel of Vec's weapon and turning it aside with no more apparent effort than closing a door, while his other hand found the pressure point at Vec's wrist and simply ended the argument. Vec went down hard, weapon skittering across the deck, and did not get back up. The remaining figures hesitated, just long enough, and Dax's voice came out of the red light, still quiet, still almost gentle, which was somehow the most frightening thing about it. "You can walk away from this," he said. "Right now, while it's still an option. Or you can find out what happens next. I'd genuinely rather you walked away." Two of them ran. The last one didn't, and regretted it within 3 seconds, folding to the deck beside his fallen comrades with a small, surprised sound. Sael stood frozen against the corridor wall, her shoulder throbbing, staring at the man she had known for 11 years, who had just moved through 6 armed opponents faster than she could track, and felt something in her understanding of the universe quietly, irrevocably rearrange itself. Sael. Dax was beside her now, his hand light on her uninjured shoulder, his voice already softening back toward the one she knew, though it hadn't fully returned yet. "Are you hurt?" "You," she said, and found she had no way to finish the sentence. "I'll explain everything," he said. "I promise. But we need to reach Ren, and I need to know how many more of them are still on this deck, before I let myself think too hard about what you just watched me do." Ren, it turned out, was bruised but upright, already pulling herself off the deck with the particular fury of a security chief who has just been outclassed in front of her overseer and does not intend to let it happen a second time. She looked at the 4 unconscious figures, then at Dax, then at Sael, and something that might have been a laugh escaped her, thin and disbelieving. "I flagged your access logs 3 days ago," Ren said to Dax, not quite an accusation. 11 off-duty visits to the lower shafts. "I told myself it wasn't against us." "It wasn't," Dax said. "I've been mapping every route off this deck that doesn't run through a main corridor, ever since I overheard something I didn't like the shape of, 3 weeks ago, in a supply line I had no business listening to. I didn't know what it was building toward. I wanted to be ready regardless." Ren studied him for a long moment, the way she studied everyone once, hard, when she was deciding how much trust to extend going forward. "You could have told me. I run security on this station. That's exactly the kind of concern I exist to hear." "I know," Dax said. "I almost did, twice. I didn't have anything solid enough to bring you, and I've spent a long time learning that half-formed warnings from someone with an unexplained skill set tend to get people asking questions about the skill set instead of the warning." He held her gaze, steady, no apology in it, only honesty. "That was a mistake. I see that clearly enough now. I'm sorry it cost you a beating in a corridor that I might have helped you avoid, if I'd trusted you with half of what I actually knew." Ren considered that, then gave a short, tired nod, the closest thing to forgiveness her particular temperament allowed for on a night that had already asked too much of everyone in it. Apology accepted. Next time, bring me the half-formed warning anyway. I'd rather chase down 10 false alarms than miss one real one because you were worried about my reaction. Understood, Dax said, and Sael, watching the two of them settle something that mattered between themselves in the middle of a crisis neither had fully finished processing, felt a small, strange warmth cut through the fear still working its way out of her own chest. Overhead, the station-wide alert finally cascaded through the corridor speakers, 3 decks too late to have prevented any of what had just happened. And somewhere above them, Korrin Vex coup, for that was clearly what it was, Sael understood now, not simple theft but the opening move of something far larger, was still, as far as the rest of the station knew, entirely successful. They reached the command deck to find it already lost. Not through violence. Through paperwork, which in some ways was worse. Vex staff had used the 2 hours of confusion following a false hull breach containment in progress announcement, broadcast, Sael would later learn, from a console Vex had accessed with credentials that should never have worked after his arrest 3 decks below, to convene an emergency continuity session with the senior duty officers, most of whom had been asleep an hour earlier and had no way to know their deputy director was, at that exact moment, unconscious in a maintenance corridor. Overseer Korrin is unaccounted for and possibly injured in the breach, a recorded loop of Vex's own voice was saying, looping on the command deck's main display as Sael and Dax and a limping Ren Carvers stepped off the lift into a room full of startled duty officers. Per emergency continuity protocol, command authority transfers to the senior available officer until her status is confirmed. I'm confirmed, Sael said, into the sudden ringing silence of a dozen officers turning to stare at her. I'm right here. The relief in the room was immediate, and almost funny, if any of it had been funny at all. Junior officers who had spent 2 hours quietly panicking under a protocol none of them had ever expected to actually see invoke sagged with visible relief. One of them, a young Ithran tech named Corvel, actually started laughing before catching herself. Overseer, the report said you were missing, possibly injured in the breach. The report was a lie built by the man who caused the breach, Sael said, and let that sit in the room a moment before continuing. Deputy Director Vex used tonight's breach as cover for an unlicensed cargo transfer to a shipping registry connected to the Asphalt Combine. When that failed, he tried to use false continuity protocols to seize command authority while I was, in his estimation, unavailable to contest it. He's currently in restraint in Cargo Bay 4's maintenance corridor, along with 4 members of his crew. The room absorbed this in the particular stunned quiet of people realizing they had, in the space of a few hours, nearly handed control of an entire station to a man who did not deserve it and had very nearly gotten away with it through nothing more dramatic than a well-timed lie and forged authorization codes. How, Corvel finally managed, did 4 armed people end up in restraint? Every eye in the room turned toward Dax, who stood quietly near the lift, doing his level best to look like a man who had spent the last 2 hours doing hydroponics maintenance rather than dismantling an armed coup with his bare hands. That's a longer conversation, Sael said, before Dax could offer whatever modest deflection he was clearly assembling. One we'll have. Right now I want lockdown on any remaining Asphalt Link personnel, a status check on every deck, and someone to get Chief Carvers to medical before she pretends that limp isn't as bad as it looks. The room moved. Officers who had been frozen in confused loyalty to a false emergency protocol 2 minutes earlier snapped into the kind of efficient motion that made Sael, despite everything, briefly and fiercely proud of the crew she'd spent 11 years building. Corvel lingered a moment longer than the others, glancing toward Dax with an expression caught somewhere between gratitude and open curiosity. For what it's worth, Overseer, she said, half of us on this deck would have stood behind Deputy Director Vex in an hour if you hadn't walked through that door when you did. He was convincing. I want you to know that, because I think it matters more than anyone's going to want to admit later, once this all gets written up as a clean victory. It matters to me, Sael said. It's why I want a full review of the continuity protocol before this station ever relies on it again. A lie shouldn't be able to move that fast through people I trust. No, Corvel agreed. It shouldn't. She hesitated at the edge of the console bank, then added, quieter, I'm glad you're the one who actually walked through the door, though. For what it's worth. So am I, Sael said, and meant it more than the simple exchange led on. For a moment, it felt like the crisis was already over. It was not. Chief Engineer Bren Talon's voice cut across the command deck's comm a moment later, tight with an urgency Sael had heard from him exactly twice before in 11 years, both times during genuine reactor emergencies. Overseer, we have a problem in the refinery core. Someone accessed the primary coolant regulation system from an internal terminal in the last 10 minutes, and it isn't reading like an accident. Sael felt the false relief of a moment ago drain out of her entirely. Vex crew, she said. How many did we account for? 5, Wren said grimly, forcing herself upright despite the medic hovering nearby. Vec had 6 with him at the breach, and at least 2 more ran when Dax, she gestured, not quite finding the right word for what she'd witnessed, handled the corridor. That leaves at least 1 unaccounted for. Maybe more, if the combine put people aboard we don't know about. The refinery core, Dax said quietly, and something in his voice had gone very still. If someone destabilizes coolant regulation on a station this size. We lose the core, Bren's voice said over the comm, grim and final. And if the core goes, we lose the station. All of it. Everyone aboard. The refinery core sat at the heart of Corvel Station, a massive cylindrical chamber 3 decks tall, ringed with coolant conduits thick as a person's torso, lit by the low blue glow of containment fields holding back heat that could, mismanaged for even a handful of minutes, cascade into a failure violent enough to crack the station's hull along every seam at once. Sael had walked past the core 1,000 times in 11 years and never once thought of it as dangerous. It was simply the station's heart, steady and reliable, the thing that made everything else possible. Standing at the access corridor with Dax beside her and Bren's voice tight in her earpiece, she understood for the first time just how much trust that steadiness had always required, and how easily a single desperate person could turn it into a weapon. One person, working alone, at a terminal on the lower access ring, Bren reported. I can't get eyes on them without walking a tech directly into the chamber, and I don't have anyone I'm willing to send in blind. I'll go, Dax said. Absolutely not, Sael said, immediately, before she'd fully thought it through, and then found she meant it with a force that surprised her. I've already what? Dax's voice was gentle, but there was no give in it. Sael. Whoever's in there is one wrong keystroke from killing everyone on the station, including the 2 of us standing in this corridor. I am, genuinely, the person best equipped to walk in there and make sure that doesn't happen. She looked at him, really looked, the way she hadn't quite let herself since the corridor fight 2 hours earlier, and saw, underneath the calm, tired kindness she'd known for 11 years, something else. Something that had always been there, folded away, and waiting, the way a blade waits inside a sheath everyone mistakes for decoration. Who trained you? She asked, because she needed to know, right now, before she let him walk into that chamber, to do what you did tonight. A program that doesn't officially exist, Dax said, run by a government that will deny I was ever part of it, if you ask them directly. It's called the Quiet Core. We are trained from adolescence to hold our own reflexes back, deliberately, consciously, because humans react faster under threat than most species find comfortable to be near, and a diplomat who startles the room he's supposed to be calming isn't much use to anyone. We call it holding still. It isn't armor we put on. It's the opposite. It's the mask we wear the rest of the time, so nobody has to know what's underneath it unless the moment actually calls for it. And tonight called for it. Tonight, Dax said quietly, someone put a hand on you, and I stopped holding still. Sael studied his face in the low light of the corridor, searching for the stranger she'd glimpsed in that first fight and finding, underneath it, still, entirely, the man she'd known for 11 years. How many people know? On this station, I mean. Before tonight. None, Dax said. That's not modesty. It's the job. The Corps doesn't post us anywhere with a partner or a handler who knows what we are, because the whole design depends on nobody knowing until the moment it matters. I've spent 11 years being genuinely, completely alone with this, Sael, in a way I don't think I ever let myself admit even to myself, because admitting it would have meant admitting how much I wanted someone to know anyway. That sounds exhausting. It was, he said, simply, no self-pity in it, just fact, the way he might have described a long shift or a difficult negotiation. I used to think that was just the cost of the work. Necessary. Worth it, if it meant nobody on a station like this ever had to be afraid of the person standing next to them at dinner. He glanced toward the sealed chamber ahead, the low blue light bleeding out around its edges. I don't have time to make this sound better than it is right now. I just needed you to hear it from me, once, before I go in there, in case tonight goes worse than I'm expecting it to. Don't, Sael said, sharper than she intended. Don't say it like that. I'm not saying goodbye, Dax said, and something almost like his usual warmth crept back into his voice, steadying them both. I'm saying I'd rather you know the whole shape of me before I walk through that door than have you find out the rest of it secondhand, from a Commonwealth report, if the day ever comes that I'm not the one telling you. Sael felt something in her chest crack open, not with fear this time but with something far more complicated, and found she had no time at all to examine it, because Bren's voice cut back through the comm, sharper now. Coolant regulation just spiked another 2% past baseline. Whoever's in there isn't stalling anymore. Overseer, if you're going to make a call, make it now. Sael looked at Dax one last time. Go, she said. Come back. Always, he said, and was already moving into the chamber before she'd finished exhaling. The access ring inside the refinery core was narrow, lit in the same low blue as the containment field above, and Dax moved through it the way he'd moved through the corridor 2 hours earlier, not rushing, not slow either, simply present in each place a half-second before anyone watching expected him to be. He found the saboteur at the third terminal bank, a wiry figure in an unmarked void suit exactly like the ones from the cargo bay, one glove hand hovering over the final confirmation key that would push the coolant regulation into a cascade neither Bren nor anyone else on the station would be able to reverse in time. Don't, Dax said, quiet, steady, the same voice he used to calm a frightened youngling or talk down a furious union rep. Whatever they're paying you, whatever they told you this was, it isn't worth what happens in the next 4 minutes if you press that key. The figure's hand didn't move from the console. Vex caught, they said, voice tight with something that might have been fear or might have been the particular desperation of someone who has already gone too far to walk back the choice they've made. Whole operation's blown. This is the only leverage the Combines got left. They don't get the ore, nobody gets the ore, ever, because there's no station left standing to mine it. That's not leverage, Dax said. That's killing everyone on this deck for spite, including you. There's no route out of this chamber that gets you clear before containment fails, and I don't think whoever gave you that order was planning on you surviving it either way. For a moment, the figure hesitated, hand trembling above the key, and Dax closed the last few meters between them slowly, deliberately, hands visible, offering nothing that looked like a threat. I don't want to hurt you, he said. I would genuinely rather you just step back from that console and let me shut this down. Nobody else has to get hurt tonight. That's still true, right up until the second you press that key. After that, it stops being true for both of us. Something in the figure's shoulder sagged, exhaustion, or the sudden weight of a decision they'd never fully wanted to make, and the hand drew back from the console, just slightly. It was enough. Dax closed the last distance in a single fluid motion, one hand closing over the figure's wrist before the key could be pressed by accident or reflex, guiding them both away from the console with no more force than the moment required. The figure sagged against the terminal bank, the fight going out of them all at once, the way it does for people who have been running on fear and adrenaline for hours longer than any body is built to sustain it. Dax lowered them gently to the deck rather than letting them fall, checked, with the same unhurried thoroughness he brought to a cracked irrigation line, that they weren't injured, and only then straightened to key the terminal back to its baseline configuration, his hand steady on controls that, a minute earlier, had been a hair's breadth from ending everyone's night for good. The fight, such as it was, ended there, without a single blow struck. Cause stabilizing, Bren's voice said over the comm a moment later, thin with relief. Coolant regulations back inside normal parameters. Whatever he did in there, it worked. Sael, still standing at the access corridor with her hands pressed flat against the cold bulkhead, felt her knees genuinely threaten to give out beneath her for the first time all night. Dax emerged from the chamber a few minutes later, the saboteur restrained and handed off to a waiting security detail, his hand steady, his breathing even, looking, if anything, faintly apologetic for having caused her so much worry. I told you I'd come back, he said. Sael crossed the corridor and hit him once, lightly, on the shoulder, which was the least dignified thing she had done as overseer in 11 years, and the thing she regretted least. Don't ever do that to me again, she said, and then, because the fear was still working its way out of her system in strange directions, added, also, I would like you to teach me exactly how fast you can actually move. I have apparently spent 11 years vastly underestimating my own liaison specialist. Dax's mouth twitched, the old familiar warmth finally, fully returning to his face. I promise, that was never on purpose. I believe you, Sael said. I'm still furious about it. That's fair, he said. I'd be furious too. The Commonwealth investigator arrived 4 days later, a careful, unhurried man named Idris Halloway who spent 2 full days reviewing security logs, interviewing witnesses, and asking Sael more questions about Ashfold combined shipping manifests than she had known there were questions to ask. Vec and the remnants of his crew were transferred off station under Commonwealth escort on the 2nd day, bound for a tribunal that would take, Halloway estimated, the better part of a year to reach any conclusion. Sael found she did not particularly want to watch the transport leave, and did not. Halloway spent considerably less time on the matter of Daxorin's conduct during the crisis, which surprised Sael until he explained, over a cup of station-brewed tea in her office on his final afternoon aboard, that the quiet core existence was, technically, still not something he was cleared to discuss, and that his official report would simply note that liaison staff assisted station security in neutralizing the threat, which was, he admitted with the faintest trace of a smile, doing quite a lot of quiet work in a very short sentence. Off the record, Halloway said, setting down his cup, I've reviewed 6 incidents involving quiet core personnel over the last decade. Every one ends with someone in your position asking me the same question. What question is that? Whether it's safe to keep someone like that close to you, once you know what they're capable of holding back. Sael thought about the 11 years before that night. The paper flowers Dax grew in the hydroponics bay purely because he liked the way Parrot's face lit up when they bloomed, the folding tile games he genuinely, consistently lost, the countless small kindnesses that had nothing at all to do with reflex speed or Commonwealth training programs. She thought about the 4 seconds in the coolant chamber where he'd chosen to talk a frightened, desperate person down rather than simply ending the threat the fastest way available to him, because some part of him, even under that much pressure, had refused to become more than the moment actually required. I think, Sael said slowly, that the version of him capable of moving that fast isn't the dangerous part. The dangerous part would be if he ever stopped choosing not to. Halloway considered that for a long moment, then nodded, as if she'd passed some quiet test he hadn't told her she was taking. For what it's worth, Overseer, he said, gathering his things. In 6 incidents, I've never once seen that choice go the other way. Tess Corvin found her in the mess hall the following week, settling across the table with her usual bowl of pale mash and her usual lack of preamble. I told you, the old woman said, that there was a difference between gentleness that simply is, and gentleness that is chosen. You did. Was I right? Sael thought of Dax at the console, of the sagging shoulders of a frightened saboteur he had chosen to talk down instead of drop, of 11 years of paper flowers and lost folding tile games that had never, not once, been a lie. You were right that it was a choice, Sael said. You were wrong that it made him dangerous to us. It's the reason he never was. Tess made a small clicking sound that might, in an Ithran of her age, have been the closest thing to satisfaction she permitted herself, and said nothing further on the subject, which Sael had come to understand was the old woman's version of admitting she'd learned something too. Parrot cornered Dax outside the hydroponics bay that same afternoon, wing plates rattling with the particular indignant energy only a 9-year-old could sustain for an entire week without tiring of it. They said you fought 6 people, Parrot announced, without preamble, in a tone that suggested this was either the most exciting or most personally offensive thing to have happened on the station in the hatchling's entire memory. And you never told us. It wasn't really something to bring up over the folding tile game, Dax said. You could have mentioned it once. Parrot's antennae drooped, an expression of profound betrayal. I've been telling everyone you're slow. I said it in front of the whole education pod. I am slow, Dax said, entirely straight-faced. At folding tile, specifically. I've lost to you 11 times running. That's different and you know it. Is it? Dax crouched down to the hatchling's eye level, the old warmth fully back in his voice now, easy and unguarded. I promise you, Parrot, the part of me that plays folding tile with you every week is exactly as real as the part that handled things 3 decks below the command deck. I didn't hide one to protect the other. I just didn't think you needed to carry both of them around in your head at the same time. You're 9. You've got enough to carry already. Parrot considered this with the grave seriousness hatchlings reserved for questions that mattered more than they were willing to admit out loud. Will you still lose on purpose? Every single time, Dax said. That part was never an act. Parrot seemed, on the whole, satisfied by this, and demanded a rematch on the spot, which Dax accepted with the resigned good humor of a man who genuinely did not mind losing, not even a little, not even now that everyone finally knew he didn't have to. Dax was waiting for her on the observation deck that evening, exactly where she'd known he would be, watching the slow bruised turn of the gas giant below through the long window, a mug of tea gone cold in his hands. "How away leave?" he asked, as she settled beside him. "An hour ago." He was surprisingly gentle with your file, considering. "The Corps usually is. Bad for recruitment if word gets out that we are all quietly terrifying." He said it lightly, but Sael caught the faint undercurrent beneath it, the old habit of making himself smaller and softer than the truth, worn thin now but not entirely gone. "You don't have to do that," she said. "Hold still. Not with me. Not anymore." Dax was quiet for a long moment, watching the storms turn below them. "I used to think holding still was the whole job," he said finally. "Be calm. Be soft. Make people forget what you're capable of, so they never have to be afraid of you in the first place. It's a good way to keep a station peaceful. It's a lonely way to actually live in one. And now I think I'd rather you just knew," he said, "and stayed anyway." Sael leaned into his shoulder, feeling the same steady, unhurried warmth she'd trusted for 11 years without ever fully understanding why, and found, watching the storm turn below them, that she trusted it more now, not less, for finally knowing exactly what quiet strength had been holding it together the whole time. "I'm staying," she said, "though I do still expect that folding tile rematch. Properly, this time. No holding back." Dax laughed, a real laugh, unguarded, the kind she'd only heard from him a handful of times in 11 years, and for the first time since the alarm had woken her 4 days ago, Corvel Station felt, once again, entirely and ordinarily safe. "Deal," he said. "Though fair warning. I'm still going to lose on purpose." "I know," Sael said. "I've always known. I think that might be my favorite thing about you." Below them, the storm turned on, slow and vast and endless, indifferent to the quiet, dangerous, gentle man who had chosen, once again, simply to be soft.